In terms of presidents in American history, Calvin Coolidge is definitely one of the least remembered presidents. I mean, just look at his name. It sounds extremely basic. However, Coolidge's presidency were really high times in American history. Many Americans were prosperous, and there was very little economic concern. However, Coolidge's 4 years of economic prosperity quickly came to a halt under Herbert Hoover's presidency, where his 4 years were defined by the Great Depression, which ruined the lives of tens of millions of Americans. And Hoover was blamed for this depression. However, this destruction of his reputation did not need to happen because Calvin Coolidge was widely expected to run for re election in 1928 because he himself only was pretty late in the first place as a president because he only took over after Warren Harding died in 1922, which made 1924 his technical first election. So it was widely expected that Calvin Coolidge would run again in 1928 until he shocked everybody by saying, I choose not to run. So, what if Coolidge actually did run in 1928? Well, for starters, he was running against Al Smith, who was just a really bad candidate. And even though America was very anti Catholic at the time, I still think even if Al Smith was not Catholic, he still would have lost in a landslide just because of how popular Coolidge was in 1928. This election would not even be close. Coolidge would win in an absolute landslide, winning some northeastern states that Hoover even lost in real life. I think one of the key differences between Hoover and Coolidge in this new presidency would just be their attitudes. Hoover was much more hands on and much more of a sort of engineer when he became president. He was more so into the idea of governments getting involved. And while he wasn't a totally interventionist like FDR was, and he did support only limited government intervention, and even then it had to be cooperation, not direct intervention. This is still different from Calvin Coolidge's stance, which was more so just nonchalance and kind of just letting the market play out as it was. In fact, Hoover tried to get solutions multiple times, and this was the complete opposite of Coolidge, who mostly deferred to his Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who was extremely laissez faire. Hoover, though, more so took things into his own hands and kind of disagreed with Mellon on times regarding his hands off approach. So, as we can see, the main difference between Coolidge and Hoover in this alternate term would be their attitudes. Coolidge would be much more hands off than Hoover. In fact, regarding the agricultural crisis at this time, Calvin Coolidge did very little about it when he was president, which infuriated many farmers, and Hoover actually did try to remedy the issue, only for it to ultimately get worse. I think Coolidge wouldn't have even tried to attempt to solve the issue, just like he did in his first term. I think when the stock market would ultimately collapse, and yes, it would still collapse because speculation was just getting really out of hand at this point. I think Coolidge would approach the issue differently than Hoover. Hoover tried to organize with banks and labor institutions and come with some kind of solution. Coolidge, on the other hand, would have not done what Hoover did and would have been much more non interventionist and likely would have still tried to let the issue play out by itself, or he would have just deferred to do exactly what Andrew Mellon would tell him to do. And ultimately, this image of Hoover being someone who didn't do anything during the Great Depression is completely false. He tried everything he could to fix the issue. It's just everything he did made it much worse. For Coolidge though, this image might actually be accurate because I actually don't think Coolidge would do that much during the Great Depression. I think he would have approached the issue a lot like Harding did in the 1920s depression and would have thought that the outcome would be the same. And while he still may intervene a little bit, this intervention would be extremely minimal. And thus, the Americans would likely see Coolidge as a detached and emotionless man who was not interested in helping out the people. And Coolidge would sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act also. Coolidge was a big proponent of tariffs during his time as president. He was a Republican from the Northeast. So there is no way that he would not have signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law. And thus this would lead to the Great Depression ultimately becoming much more worse, with Coolidge's only actions really being increasing tariffs and maybe occasional cooperation with banks and big businesses. And one thing Hoover did that I think Coolidge would not do again is the tax increases. Coolidge was a big opponent of tax increases. I don't think he would have increased taxes. So, yeah, the image of Hoover would be much better than among Americans. He would be remembered as a humanitarian who saved millions of lives in World War I and even maybe in World War II, assuming he still does this later on in his life. And he would be remembered just for the 98% of his life that wasn't his presidency. And thus, in 1932 election, I think Hoover may still run for president, or it may be someone else, but regardless, the result is still absolute domination by the Democrats. And I think FDR would ultimately become president, and his call for economic intervention would become even more prevalent, with Coolidge probably doing little to nothing. So Coolidge's image now by historians would be someone who had a very successful first term that would ultimately be overshadowed by a failure of a second term that was much more poor and was ultimately categorized and defined by his nonchalance towards the Great Depression. So, yeah, that would be Coolidge's reputation, and ultimately it was a great decision for him in hindsight not to run for re-election in 1928. So anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel. Mr. US History, out.